Your guns need bullets, the alien laughed, until he saw a single magazine empty a squad. The single bullet sat on the table between the two officers, perfectly still. Its brass casing reflected the blue wash of the observation deck panels, heavy and dull against the clean glass. Commander Cassian Valen did not pick it up. He watched the human sergeant, Jerk Vance, roll his right shoulder to click a loose joint before his thick fingers touched the worn leather sling of his case. Outside the wide view screen, the subterranean arena known as the Obsidian Tier waited in absolute silence. The tactical board says your weapon needs single cartridges, Valen said. His gravelly voice was low, masked by the rhythmic purr of the secondary cooling lines behind his seat. The board says your squad is missing 88 seconds of continuous field charge because you carry metal instead of a cell. Jerk did not look up from his latches. The board thinks a line never breaks, sir. They started grinning before the chamber closed, Valen muttered, his thumb tracing a spent, scorched titanium screw between his knuckles, a nervous habit he had kept since the breach at the red border. They thought the old timber was a burial box. The room smelled of recycled air and the mineral bite of ion-filtered light. Through the thick glass, rows of Xylari cadets leaned back in their tiered benches, their translucent skin glimmering like wet salt under the white training arcs. On their shoulders rested sleek grav-pulse carbines that never coughed, never smoked, and never ran out of light. To them, the human was an administrative error, a primitive recruit from a soft world who had brought an archaic artifact to a terminal combat trial. Jerk popped the brass latches of his long box. The scent of mineral oil and dried leather drifted across the table, heavy enough to cut through the clean chemical tang of the observation deck. "Let them grin," Jerk said. He lifted the dark, unpolished Springfield rifle from its velvet bed, his palms fitting into the notched wood with the casual familiarity of a man handling his own skin. A plasma cell forgives a terrible stance. 180 grains of lead demands your entire spine. Valen watched him slide a long, notched steel magazine into the receiver. The sound was not the soft chime of an energy cell locking into a guide rail. It was a sharp, mechanical clack that hit the glass plates of the gallery and stopped the low murmuring in the front row of benches. I wish I could tell you the trial ended with that first mechanical noise. It didn't. You will want to hear how the steel held when the floor broke. Stay close. Below the glass, the floor of the Obsidian Tier began to shift. The gray ferrocrete blocks slid backward on hydraulic tracks, opening a wide, jagged valley simulation filled with broken slabs, artificial shale, and 3 concrete pillars meant to mock field cover. At the far northern wall, the heavy iron-plated doors of the suppression arrays began to rise with a long, hollow groan that vibrated through the floorboards. Jerk stepped away from the table, his heavy boots crunching on the loose grit near the threshold. He did not wear a smart-linked ocular implant over his eye. His forehead was bare, lined with small white scars from old mortar fragments, his gaze fixed entirely on the dark gap where the first machines would drop. Valen reached for the central panel. His hand lingered over the safety toggle for 3 seconds, his fingers steady but his eyes fixed on the massive weight of the primary drone deployment columns. The Academy records show 0 system failures in 3 centuries, Valen said, his voice dropping into the recording log. They do not log the trials that drop below the line. Initialize the drop, Jerk said. The instructor's console chimed once, a clean high note that signaled the start of the first wave. High above the valley, 8 autonomous alloy drones detached from their ceiling hooks and fell into the simulation. They landed without a sound, their multi-jointed legs absorbing the kinetic shock as their red sensor bars swept the broken slabs. They moved like a single hand, covering each other's flanks, their internal capacitors whistling as they drew charge for their forward emitters. Jerk did not run for the stone pillars. He dropped into a classic infantry kneel right at the edge of the deployment line, his left elbow locking over his knee, his right shoulder absorbing the heavy wood of the buttstock. The first machine cleared the shale ridge, its sensor bar locking onto the human's torso. The Springfield cracked. It was not the clean, high-frequency hiss the cadets were trained to expect. It was a physical thunderclap, a kinetic explosion that hit the narrow walls of the Obsidian Tier and bounced back in a solid wave of sound. Cadet Tyrell, sitting in the front tier, jumped backward, his grav carbine striking the metal railing with a sharp chime. The lead drone did not twitch or flag for simulated damage. The 180 grain slug hit the center of its layered chest plate at 2,600 feet per second. The alloy did not melt, it shattered. A clean round hole opened through the thickest section of its front defense, followed by a spray of bright copper sparks as the bullet tore through the central processing core and exited the rear casing. The machine dropped straight down, its internal gyros roaring in a brief, dying screech before the lights behind its lens went dark. "Casing 1, Jerk muttered. He worked the bolt. The motion was an aggressive manual sweep of his right hand up, back, forward, down. A hot brass cylinder flew from the ejection port, turning twice in the air before it hit the concrete deck with a clear, rhythmic ring. The remaining 7 drones rerouted their paths instantly, their processors tracking the source of the acoustic detonation. 2 of them split to the left, their tread legs grinding against the loose stone as they tried to establish a crossfire across the narrow valley floor. Jerk did not adjust his kneel. He pivoted his hips 3 inches, the iron sights alignment cutting through the blue glare of the arena lamps. He squeezed the trigger again. The second report doubled the echo in the room. 50 yards out, the left-hand drone jerked sideways, its tracking arm sheared completely off at the servo joint by the sheer weight of the impact. It spun into the side of the ferrocrete pillar, its remaining legs flailing against the smooth stone before Jerk's third round took it through the lower power housing. Across the gallery, the whispers had stopped. The Zalari cadets leaned forward against the glass, their translucent fingers flat against the panels. Saul Raz, the top-rated marksman of the Vanguard class, looked down at his own pulse carbine, his lower eye cavities narrowing as he watched the human's shoulder roll against the wood with every shot. "He isn't waiting for a target lock," Saul Raz whispered, his hand tightening on the pristine barrel of his weapon. "He is directing the mass before the machine completes the turn." Jerk fired 4 more times in a steady, unhurried cadence. Crack, clack, clack, crack. The rhythm was a physical thing that filled the spaces between the arena's hydraulic hum. Every report was followed by the sound of breaking metal on the valley floor. Every manual sweep of the bolt dropped another hot brass cylinder onto the pile near his boots. The 8th drone tried to retreat behind the central concrete wall, its sensor bar flickering as its automated logic routine searched for a non-ballistic countermeasure. It did not find one. Jerk's final shot caught the edge of its exposed drive sprocket as it turned. The machine flipped onto its side, its tracks spinning in the air until the internal safety switch cut the line. The valley floor went still. A thin, blue haze of burnt gunpowder began to drift up toward the exhaust fans, smelling of sulfur and old charcoal. Jerk stood up slowly. He pressed the magazine release, catching the empty steel clip in his left palm before it could hit the concrete. He set it on his hip, his fingers already reaching for the second leather pouch on his belt. Valen looked down at the simulation board. Every indicator for the first wave was red, marked with a hard-coded terminal error that the system's predictive matrix had not categorized. 8 targets, Valen said into the deck receiver. 8 impacts, total time 12 seconds. "The barrel is still cold," Jerk said. He slid the fresh clip into the floor of the receiver, the metal clicking home with that same flat finality. "Tell the high tactician to open the second tier." High above the observation room, the private box remained dark, but the small silver leafing on the command console began to pulse. High tactician Olerzen was watching. Valen knew the old avian hybrid was there because the auxiliary cooling pumps suddenly doubled their intake, preparing the secondary matrices for something the standard curriculum did not include. Valen turned the heavy auxiliary dial near his side. "Phase 2 is authorized," he said quietly. "They are clearing the restriction codes now." The red warning lamps around the obsidian tier began to rotate, casting long, bloody streaks across the concrete pillars. The security gate at the back of the valley did not slide. It retracted with an explosive snap that sent a cloud of dry shale dust into the path. Jerk did not move back toward the table. He took 3 slow steps into the simulated valley, his boots crunching lightly through the glittering pile of spent brass he had left behind. "The system is resetting the balance metrics," Valen called out through the deck mic, his fingers tightening on the titanium screw until his skin went pale. "The next line has 50 targets. They are authorized for live kinetic response." Jerk did not look back. He adjusted his grip on the walnut stock, his right index finger resting flat against the steel guard, his breathing dropping into the low, steady measure of a man who had already seen the end of the day. The reinforced barriers did not just slide away. They dropped into the floor with a heavy, pressurized hiss that threw a cloud of dry limestone dust across the front rank of the simulation valley. Commander Valen watched the tactical display flicker as the machine counts multiplied. High tactician Olerzen's private terminal had bypassed the standard training limitations, feeding a restricted baseline into the arena's automated grid. The icons on the glass console were no longer blue training shapes, they had shifted to the deep crimson of active perimeter enforcement arrays. The 50 advanced drones did not advance in a line. They poured from the lower bunkers like a swarm of iron insects, their wider torsos housing multi-phase capacitors that began to hum at a frequency that made the observation glass vibrate. Each unit was wrapped in a light, shimmering layer of adaptive energy, the tactical shield that had made kinetic armor obsolete across 3 sectors. Jerk Vance did not retreat to the doorway. He broke into a low, heavy run toward the closest ferrocrete slope, his boots kicking up loose shale as the first salvo of plasma bolts cut through the dust. The blue energy streams screamed across the distance, slicing through the artificial stone barriers and turning the loose gravel into liquid slag. A near miss charred the ground right where Jerk had been standing a second earlier, the heat so intense it left a smell of ozone and burnt stone in the air. Jerk dropped into a long slide behind the concrete slope, his right shoulder hitting the base of the pillar as he brought the rifle up in one continuous motion. The Zalari cadets above did not cheer. The mockery had faded into a tense, collective lean against the display rail, their translucent skin turning a pale, dull gray under the crimson warning lights. Jerk did not look at the main swarm. He focused on the lead unit rounding the western edge of the support beam. He squeezed the trigger and the thunderclap hit the chamber again. The 180-grain slug hit the shimmering blue envelope of the drone's adaptive shield. In the War College text, an energy barrier was supposed to absorb the frequency of any incoming strike and disperse it across the hull. But the lead slug carried no frequency. It was just fast, raw weight breaking through glass. The shield did not flash or modulate, it shattered with a sound like tearing tin, the bullet punching through the front plate and severing the internal servo line. The machine dropped, its shoulder cannon firing once into the dirt as its processing core went dark. Casing 9, Jerk said, his hand sweeping the manual bolt back with a sharp, heavy stroke. The second drone tried to cross the gap behind its fallen partner, its electronic brain already trying to calculate the trajectory of the acoustic report. Jerk didn't give it the seconds it needed. He fired through the edge of the concrete pillar itself, the bullet drilling through 6 inches of synthetic stone before it caught the machine's center mass. The drone flipped backward, its internal power line rupturing in a spray of white sparks that blinded the sensors of the 2 units behind it. From the high command box, High Tactician Olerzen's cybernetic ocular lens auto-zoomed with a harsh, repetitive click. His silver-tipped feathers flattened against his neck armor as he looked down at the tactical readout. The system was failing to balance the engagement metrics. For 3 centuries, every tactical simulation had been built on the absolute certainty that an infantryman would waste energy cells against an adaptive shield until their weapon overheated or their reserve ran dry. The computer's predictive matrix had no category for a fighter who did not use a targeting loop, who did not emit a signal, and whose weapon did not lose efficiency as the chamber grew hot. The dread in the upper box was not a sudden shout, it was a total absence of movement. Olerzen did not reach for his ceremonial bone stave. He stood entirely still, his lower arms twitching against his chest plates as he watched the human sergeant dismantle the 3rd rank of the suppression array without a single target lock. "The shield frequency is 0, Valen muttered into the primary recording log, his hand rolling the spent titanium screw so hard the metal bit into his palm. "The plates aren't resisting because there is nothing to track. It's just mass." Down in the smoke, Jerk Vance was moving between the broken supports with a rhythm that felt more like a machine than the drones he was hunting. He did not scream or throw wild rounds into the haze. He fired in short, deliberate pairs, one to drop the shield, one to break the core. A drone tried to flank him from the upper shale ridge, its shoulder emitters glowing red as they accumulated charge for a full burst suppression fire. Jerk didn't turn his body. He threw a spent steel magazine high into the air toward the eastern wall. The machine's automated tracking logic instantly registered the fast-moving metal object, its sensor bar pivoting 3 degrees to scan the projectile for an energy signature. That fraction of a second was all the human had asked for. Jerk's rifle cracked from the shadows below the ridge, the bullet entering the drone's unshielded sprocket joint and tearing the lower drive chassis apart. The machine tumbled down the slope, its tracks grinding against the ferrocrete until it hit the valley floor with a dull clang. "Clip 3, Jerk whispered. He dropped the empty steel clip into his palm, his fingers moving through the reload dance in less than 2 seconds under pressure. The mechanical clack of the fresh magazine hitting the receiver was the only warning the remaining units received before the thunderclaps resumed. The smoke in the center of the obsidian tier had grown so thick the upper display screen began to glitch, its optical sensors unable to pierce the heavy charcoal haze rising from the burnt powder. The cadets could no longer see the human, they could only see the red icons on the tactical map vanishing in pairs behind the wall of gray dust. 40 drones, 35-30. Solraz stood up from his bench, his hand dropping away from his carbine entirely. His 4 eye cavities were wide, fixed on the damage values scrolling across the monitor. "He isn't clearing a course," the cadet said, his voice dropping into a flat whisper that carried through the silent tier. "He is rewriting the distance between the line and the target." Inside the smoke, Jerk Vance took a short, sharp breath, his back pressed against the fractured edge of the central pillar. The burn on his left arm was throbbing beneath his sleeve, a red line of blistered skin where the plasma stream had cooked the fabric. He did not check the wound. He took one slow breath out, his right index finger resting against the steel guard as he counted the remaining clicks from the valley floor. The final 12 units were no longer advancing with their standard pack logic. They had stopped their run, their internal processors stuck in an unresolvable loop as they tried to find a tactical directive for an enemy that had no electronic footprint. Then from the far corner of the arena floor, a different sound cut through the low hum of the hydraulic systems. It was not the grinding of a drone track or the hiss of a plasma emitter. It was a cold, heavy rhythmic knocking inside the primary deployment shaft, the sound of the arena's master processor drone unlocking its heavy iron-plated restraints ahead of schedule. The master drone didn't crawl into the arena. It tore through its own guide rails with a screech of shearing alloy that killed the low hum of the exhaust fans. Commander Valen didn't check the regulatory parameters on his slate. He saw the red line on his monitor spike past the safety threshold as the machine's central accumulator began to gorge itself on the core grid's raw power. The display screen above the deck glitched twice, then went solid black before resetting to show an unauthorized combat threat. A 3-ton armored frame built with heavy tungsten carbide plates and an active triple-link plasma array. "The safety interlock is dead," Valen spoke through the emergency channel, his knuckles grinding against the small titanium screw in his pocket until the metal left a gray smudge on his thumb. "The high tactician has grounded the lift. You have 0 exit vector, Jerk." Down in the charcoal smoke, Jerk Vance didn't answer. He didn't look up at the darkened glass of the command box where the avian hybrid stood frozen. He dropped his hand to his belt, his thick fingers unhooking a heavy, scratched cylinder that smelled of stale grease and old sulfur, a standard-issue Terran trench grenade that had been sitting in his kit since the New Corinth deployment. He didn't pull the safety ring yet. He braced his spine against the ferrocrete support beam, his teeth digging into his lower lip as the skin under his wrapped sleeve began to throb with a deep, wet heat. The master drone's 3 optical lenses rotated in unison, their red focus indicators slicing through the dense gray haze like knives. It didn't search for a radio signature or a thermal silhouette. It had been programmed to look for the acoustic echo of the Springfield's report, its massive track units grinding the discarded brass casings into dust as it rotated its primary cannon toward the pillar. The first plasma salvo hit the top half of the ferrocrete column. The concrete didn't crack, it dissolved into a white, blinding mist of liquid lime that poured down like salt rain. Jerk didn't look at the melting stone above his head. He pulled the safety pin from the grease-stained cylinder with his teeth, his right shoulder rolling to click the loose joint one more time before he tossed the heavy iron tube over the edge of the shale ridge. The master drone's automated tracking matrix immediately locked onto the metallic arc of the grenade. Its secondary emitters fired a defensive grav pulse, hitting the cylinder 20 feet out and detonating the chemical core before it could reach the central drive sprocket. The explosion tore through the gray haze, throwing a solid wave of hot shale dust across the valley floor. Valen watched the tactical display map flash with a fresh error. The machine's sensor array hadn't been blinded by the flash, but the thick carbon smoke from the old Terran grenade had coated the lenses of its 3 optical loops with a fine, greasy layer of soot. The machine's targeting software hesitated, its predictive lines turning yellow as it began to sweep the fog blindly, its cannon spitting short, wild bursts of blue light that shattered the remaining concrete pillars. "The tactical link is down," Solraz whispered from the front row of benches, his translucent fingers twitching against the metal rail as he counted the manual reloads through the glass. "The machine is looking for an Empire's footprint. It doesn't know how to track a single pair of boots." Jerk emerged from the shifting smoke 40 yards to the left, his heavy boots moving without a sound across the deep piles of spent brass. His walnut stock was locked against his ribs, his iron sights cutting through the red glare of the warning lamps. He fired twice. The first slug struck the outer lens casing of the master drone's secondary optical loop, shattering the protective crystal and forcing the machine's internal logic to drop its targeting efficiency by a third. The second bullet caught the high-voltage line running between the main capacitor and the left-hand cannon. A brilliant, blinding loop of electrical fire erupted from the seam, the wire whipping against the chassis until the automated circuit breaker cut the line. The drone spun on its tracks, its remaining cannons firing a continuous stream of plasma into the shale bank behind it as its processor tried to reset the internal balance matrices. High Tactician Olerzen leaned his entire weight against the command console glass, his cybernetic eyes zooming with a fast, irregular clicking that filled the dark private box. The silver leafing on his uniform had turned dull, stained with the sweat of his own skin as the telemetry lines on his monitor began to drop toward absolute zero. The system wasn't just failing to clear the course, it was revealing an institutional void. 3 centuries of strategic doctrine had been built on the absolute assumption that superior abundance and adaptive energy cells would outlast any physical force. But the human sergeant hadn't brought a supply line, he had brought a set of rules that lived entirely inside his own muscles. The dread in the observation deck had turned into a heavy, suffocating pressure that kept the cadets from speaking. They didn't watch the tactical screen anymore. They watched the human's left hand sweep the manual bolt back, the hot brass cylinder ejecting into the dust with a flat metallic ping that outlasted the dying hum of the drone's capacitors. "Clip 4, Jerk muttered into the smoke. He slid the final notched steel magazine into the receiver, his thumb pressing the brass rounds down until the catch clicked home with a hollow ring that signaled the end of his reserve. 20 rounds left. The barrel of the Springfield was hot enough to make the grease on the barrel band sizzle, a thin thread of blue oil smoke rising from the woodwork as he adjusted his stance on the broken shale. The master drone's central lens clicked once, its internal logic finally bypassing the corrupted optical loops and switching to a primitive, low-frequency radar scan that didn't rely on light. The red indicator bar on its chest plate turned a solid, unblinking crimson. It had found the mass of the human's rifle barrel through the fog. The machine didn't fire its remaining cannon. It locked its drive sprockets and lunged forward at 30 miles per hour, its heavy tungsten-plated nose cone aimed straight at the center of the Ferrocrete ridge where Jerk stood. Jerk didn't run for the perimeter doors. He stood perfectly still in the center of the valley floor, his breath dropping into a single, slow line of cold air as the 3-ton frame closed the distance. He reached into his pocket with his left hand, his fingers touching a small, scuffed metal cylinder that didn't have a weapon marking or a regulatory serial number. It was a simple, flat brass token, the original casing from his first field trial on Earth, old and tarnished by the grease of his kit. He set the tiny cylinder on the flat surface of the concrete bench beside him, his palms smoothing the tarnished metal once before his hand went back to the rifle's grip. "Valen," Jerk's voice came through the deck mic, flat and completely devoid of weight. "The safety override code on the master console isn't an administrative lock, it's a manual key." Valen froze, his hand stopping over the toggle as the words landed. He looked down at the auxiliary panel, his gaze fixing on the small, hidden notch beneath the dial where a simple mechanical rod could lock the circuit open from the inside. The human hadn't asked for an exit, he had predicted the exact moment the system's electrical lines would fail under the load. The 3-ton chassis hit the Ferrocrete ridge with a force that sheared the anchors from the arena floor, throwing a geyser of white dust into the center of the tier. Commander Valen slammed his palm onto the manual override panel beneath his console, driving the small steel rod home into the auxiliary safety housing. The electrical connectors tore free with a heavy smell of melting rubber, locking the primary circuit open and cutting off the high command box from the arena grid. Down in the gray fog, Jerk Vance did not look back at the sparking terminal. He stood 6 feet from the grinding tracks of the master drone, his walnut stock leveled at the machine's central unshielded processor plate. His left arm was a solid mass of blistered skin beneath the tight cloth of his sleeve, but his fingers held the grain line without a single microinch of drift. The machine's automated logic did not hesitate. It had no capacity for hesitation. It recognized the human target through its primitive radar scan and initiated its final, close-range execution loop. Jerk pulled the trigger 3 times in a single grammatical heartbeat. No warning, no declaration, no mercy. The first lead slug hit the center of the armored processor plate, splitting the hardened alloy along its structural seam. The second round drilled through the fracture line, expanding into a flat lead disc that severed the main data ribbon connecting the core to the track relays. The third bullet caught the emergency fuel manifold, punching a clean hole through the pressurized line and venting a stream of liquid coolant into the white-hot capacitor banks. The drone didn't explode, it choked. A heavy, wet rattle echoed from the machine's internal turbine as the drive sprockets seized on the loose grit. The 3-ton frame tipped forward, its heavy tungsten nose cone digging a 6-inch trench into the ferrocrete before it came to an absolute rest 3 inches from Jerk's boots. The red indicator bar on its chest plate flickered twice, turned a pale amber and died. The valley floor went dead. The only sound left in the obsidian tier was the regular, rhythmic dripping of hot lubricant from the broken manifold hitting the scorched shale. Across the tiered benches, the Zalari cadet sat as still as stone. Salraz did not look up from his display rail. His 4-eye cavities were fixed on the master log where the final efficiency rating had landed. The system had registered a total collapse of the Academy's proprietary defense line, but it had logged the loss under a category that had not been used since the first generation of planetary warfare, manual resource reduction. Jerk Vance stood in the smoke, his rifle slung low over his back, his breath coming in short, measured lines that left a thin film of moisture on the receiver. He didn't raise his hands in a victory sign. He reached down and picked up the tarnished brass casing from his first field trial on Earth, sliding it back into his pocket next to the scuffed magazines. High above the floor, High Tactician Olerzen's private door hissed open. The avian hybrid didn't speak to his assistants. He walked out of the terminal bay alone, his silver-tipped feathers stained with gray soot, his obsidian stave left behind on the glass desk as he entered the transit lift that led down to the administrative docks. He didn't look at the tactical map as the terminal went dark. His cybernetic eye had stopped its zoom clicking, locked onto a single, bloodless figure moving through the debris below. "The team deployment sheet is on your slate," Valen said 3 hours later, his voice flat as he stood by the door of the empty locker bay. His hand was empty, the titanium screw left on the observation deck table. "The transit craft leaves for Outpost Larney's 12 at midnight. They are calling it a voluntary liaison group." Jerk pulled a fresh infantry shirt over his shoulders, the coarse green cloth dragging against the clear gel layer the tech drone had sprayed over his arm. "They want to know if the lead can do it twice," he said. "They want to know why the machine couldn't calculate the mass," Valen corrected him, his eyes dropping to the cased Springfield on the bench. "They think if they adjust the predictive loop they can find the frequency." "Let them adjust it," Jerk said. He clasped the long box shut, the brass latches popping into place with that same manual finality. "A rifle isn't a code, you can't patch a hole after the weight has already left the barrel." The corridor outside was quiet, the blue guidance lights dimmed for the evening shift. A single young cadet was waiting near the threshold of the transit ramp, his pristine grav carbine slung low across his lap, his hand holding a small package of field rations he didn't offer. He didn't speak as the human sergeant approached, but his lower eye cavities narrowed in a tight, unblinking line of recognition. Jerk paused at the edge of the ramp, his hand resting on the leather sling of his box. He didn't give the cadet a nod, but his thumb traced the notch on the side of his casing where the metal had worn smooth from old usage. "M14, Jerk said into the quiet of the bay. "Springfield Armory, it doesn't look for a network." The cadet looked down at his own carbine, his fingers tracing the smooth, seamless edge of the energy rail where the charging light was blinking its continuous green signal. "And when the clip is dry, then you use the timber," Jerk said. The heavy steel hatch of the transit craft rose with a long, hydraulic groan, cutting off the light from the Academy corridor. Jerk stepped through the gap into the dark interior of the cabin, his boots making a single, hollow sound against the iron deck plates before the safety locks engaged from the outside. Outside the viewport, the red moon of the dead sector was rising through the gray exhaust clouds of the launch facility, cold and indifferent to the small trail of fire that was beginning to move toward the outer line.